In the final years of the Second World War, as German forces collapsed on the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers fell into Soviet hands. What happened to them has never been fully told in the West. The numbers alone are staggering, but the numbers are only the beginning. The first significant wave of German prisoners taken by the Soviet Union did not come at the end of the war. It came in the winter of 1942, during one of the most consequential battles in modern military history. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful fighting formations in the Wehrmacht, had been pushing deep into the city of Stalingrad for months. The battle had ground down to street by street, building by building combat. German soldiers had been told that victory was close. Their commanding officer, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, had been assured by Hitler that the army would hold. Then, on November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that struck not at the heart of Stalingrad, but at the flanks, where Romanian and Italian forces stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of open steppe. Within days, the Soviet forces had encircled the entire Sixth Army. Roughly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped inside what became known as the Stalingrad Pocket. The encirclement lasted through the winter. Hitler forbade a breakout. A relief force was attempted and failed. By the time Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943, the first German field marshal in history to do so, fewer than 100,000 men were still alive inside the pocket. The months of encirclement, with no adequate food supply, no winter equipment, and no medical support, had already killed the rest. Those 91,000 survivors, gaunt, frostbitten, suffering from dysentery and exhaustion, marched out of Stalingrad into Soviet captivity. For many of them, that march was itself a death sentence. The temperature in the southern Russian steppe in February 1943 was brutal. Men without proper winter clothing, already weakened to the point of collapse, were marched across open terrain to prisoner assembly points that were, in some cases, many kilometers away. Eyewitness accounts from Soviet soldiers who observed the marching columns describe men falling and not rising. Guards in some locations permitted this. Men who fell were left where they lay. In other locations, guards ordered the fallen shot to prevent them from slowing the column. By the time survivors reached the first permanent camps, the number had already dropped sharply from the 91,000 who had surrendered. Of the approximately 91,000 Germans who surrendered at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. That figure has been documented through post-war German government investigations and cross-referenced with Soviet records made available after 1991. The overwhelming majority died in Soviet captivity, most of them within the first year. What happened to them, and to the millions of German soldiers who followed them into Soviet hands as the war turned, is a story that remained obscured for decades behind Cold War politics and the difficulty of accessing Soviet archives. What the Soviet camps looked like when those first survivors arrived, and why the conditions they found were almost identical to what their own countrymen had inflicted on the Soviet prisoners 2 years earlier, is where this story truly begins. The Soviet system for holding prisoners of war was administered by the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which also ran the domestic labor camp network known as the Gulag. When large numbers of German prisoners began arriving in 1943, the NKVD was the institution responsible for their detention, labor, and survival. The camps established for German and Axis prisoners were organized under a specific subdirectorate of the NKVD known as GUPVI, the main directorate for prisoner of war and internee affairs. On paper, this structure implied organization and oversight. In practice, the conditions across individual camps varied enormously, and in the early years of the prisoner influx, they were catastrophic. The fundamental problem was the same one that had devastated Soviet prisoners in German camps 2 years earlier. The Soviet Union in 1943 was a country under enormous strain. The industrial base had been partially evacuated east of the Ural Mountains after the German invasion. Food was rationed for the civilian population. The military consumed enormous quantities of supplies. There was simply not a surplus available to feed and house hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. This does not fully explain what followed because policy decisions, not just scarcity, shaped the conditions in the camps. but it provides the material context. The camps in which Stalingrad survivors arrived in early 1943 were, in most cases, established in remote regions of the Soviet Union, in the Ural Mountains, in Siberia, in Central Asia. Some were entirely new facilities, set up hastily to receive the sudden influx. Others were existing Gulag facilities modified to accept prisoners of war. The distinction between a prisoner of war camp and a Gulag labor camp was, in many locations, primarily administrative. The mortality rate among German prisoners in Soviet custody was highest in 1943, the year of Stalingrad. Camp records, cross-referenced with post-war German investigations, suggest that in some facilities, monthly death rates reach 10 to 15% of the population. Applied across a full year, figures like that are not sustainable. They imply near total death of the original population within months. Starvation was the primary cause. Rations allocated to prisoners on paper were rarely delivered in full at the camp level. Supply chains were unreliable. Camp administrators in remote locations had limited accountability. Men received bread in quantities that could not sustain basic physical function, supplemented occasionally with watery soup and small amounts of grain. Those already weakened by the Stalingrad encirclement were the first to go. Disease followed immediately behind starvation, as it always does in conditions of extreme physical deterioration. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis moved through the camp populations with little medical resistance. The Soviet camps had medical staff on paper. In practice, the personnel and supplies available were nowhere near sufficient to address the scale of illness. But not all German prisoners died quickly. A significant number survived long enough to enter the labor system. And what the Soviet Union did with that labor force is a chapter that connects directly to the post-war world we still live in today. By 1944, as German defeats mounted and the prisoner population grew, Soviet policy toward German prisoners underwent a significant shift. The recognition that had come to German authorities in 1942 that dead prisoners were wasted labor came now to Soviet planners as well. German prisoners were increasingly viewed not primarily as enemies to be punished or security risks to be neutralized, but as a labor asset. The Soviet Union was rebuilding, or in some cases building for the first time, industrial capacity that the war had destroyed or disrupted. Factories, mines, railways, canals, urban infrastructure, all of it required enormous quantities of human labor, and the domestic Soviet labor supply had been devastated by 4 years of war. German prisoners were put to work across an astonishing range of industries and locations. In the Donbass region of Ukraine, they worked in coal mines. In the Ural Mountains, they worked in metal processing facilities. In Moscow and Leningrad, cities the German military had targeted for destruction, they were used in reconstruction projects. German engineers and technical specialists were particularly sought after, and were sometimes held in separate facilities with marginally better conditions, in exchange for their professional expertise. The scale of this labor mobilization is often underappreciated. At its peak, the prisoner labor force in the Soviet Union numbered in the hundreds of thousands of men, working simultaneously across dozens of industrial sectors. German prisoners built roads, cleared rubble, dug foundations, operated machinery, and performed agricultural work across a geography that stretched from the Baltic region to Central Asia. The use of prisoner labor was centrally planned and administered through the NKVD. Quotas were assigned. Prisoner workers were allocated to enterprises that formally requested them. Camp administrators were held responsible for meeting production targets. Prisoners had to work regardless of their physical condition. But if they died from overwork, the labor quota suffered. This tension produced wildly inconsistent outcomes across different camps and administrators. Some prisoners later testified that work assignments, though hard, provided structure that helped them survive psychologically. Others described conditions in which men were sent to work in temperatures far below freezing, without adequate clothing, with food rations calibrated not to sustain a working body over time, but to extract maximum output before the body gave out. One of the most documented prisoner labor projects of this period was the construction of the Volga-Don Canal, a waterway connecting the Volga River to the Don River in southern Russia. German prisoners worked on this project alongside Soviet Gulag prisoners from the late 1940s until the canal's completion in 1952. The project was physically brutal, the climate extreme, and the death toll among the labor force significant. Today, the canal operates as a major commercial waterway. The labor of the men who built it, German and Soviet alike, is not commemorated at the site. As the war ended in May 1945, the prisoner population did not shrink. It exploded. What happened in the weeks and months after Germany's surrender brought the largest wave of German soldiers into Soviet hands, and with it, decisions that would affect hundreds of thousands of lives for years to come. Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, did not end the capture of German soldiers by Soviet forces. In many cases, it accelerated it. German units that had been fighting in Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Eastern Germany surrendered in the days and weeks following the armistice. Others who had been trying to reach Western Allied lines, hoping to surrender to American or British forces rather than Soviet ones, were caught before they could cross. The result was that the Soviet prisoner population, which had already grown substantially through 1944 and early 1945, surged dramatically in May and June of 1945. Estimates based on Soviet archival data and post-war German records place the total number of German and Axis soldiers who passed through Soviet captivity during and after the war at approximately 3.1 million. Of those, approximately 1.1 million did not survive to return home. This is the figure that appears consistently in the most reliable historical estimates, drawn from the joint German-Russian Historical Commission that examined the prisoner question in the 1990s and early 2000s, using both German records and Soviet archival materials that became accessible after the end of the Cold War. That figure, roughly 1.1 million dead, represents a death rate of approximately 35% of all German prisoners held by the Soviet Union. It is lower than the 57% death rate inflicted on Soviet prisoners in German custody, but it remains one of the highest prisoner mortality rates among any major power combination in the Second World War. The post-war period, from 1945 onward, saw a gradual decline in the prisoner death rate as the acute crisis of 1943 passed, and conditions in the camps slowly improved. But the improvement was uneven and slow. Men who had entered Soviet captivity in 1945 were in many cases still in the camps in 1949, 1950, and even later. The Soviet Union was not in a hurry to release a labor force that had proven economically useful. Repatriation, the formal return of prisoners to their home countries, proceeded in stages. The first large repatriation occurred in 1947, when the Soviet Union released a significant number of prisoners who were deemed unable to work due to illness or injury. These men returned to a Germany that had been divided and devastated. Many of them were unrecognizable to their families. Some had been gone for more than 4 years. The second major wave of repatriations followed in 1949, and smaller releases continued through the early 1950s. But a significant number of German prisoners remained in Soviet custody well into the mid-1950s. These were, in official Soviet designation, not prisoners of war but war criminals, men who had been convicted by Soviet military tribunals of offenses committed during the war. The legal basis for many of these convictions was, by any objective standard, thin. But the designation served to justify continued detention. The story of those men, the ones still held years after the war ended, and the political struggle to bring them home, is one of the least known chapters of the post-war period. And it involves a man whose journey from the Eastern Front to a Soviet courtroom to the German parliament became one of the defining stories of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, the official position of the Soviet Union was that all German prisoners of war had been repatriated. The men still being held, Soviet authorities maintained, were convicted criminals, individuals who had been tried, found guilty, and were serving legal sentences under Soviet law. The West German government under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer disputed this. German families who had received no confirmation of their relatives' deaths and no news of their return pressed the government for answers. The German Red Cross maintained lists of men still unaccounted for. The numbers were substantial. Estimates varied, but tens of thousands of Germans were believed to still be alive in Soviet custody. The political context made addressing this difficult. West Germany had only recently regained a degree of sovereignty after the occupations period that followed the war. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in East Germany and across Eastern Europe. Direct confrontation carried risks. And yet, the domestic pressure from German families was real and growing. In 1955, Adenauer made a decision that was controversial within West Germany and remained so for decades. He traveled to Moscow, the first West German chancellor to do so, and entered into direct negotiations with Soviet leadership, including Nikita Khrushchev, who had come to power after Stalin's death in 1953. The negotiations were difficult and extended over several days. The outcome was a diplomatic agreement. The Soviet Union would release the remaining prisoners, estimated at the time at approximately 10,000 men, in exchange for the establishment of full diplomatic relations between West Germany and the Soviet Union. West Germany had previously refused to establish such relations as long as German prisoners remained in Soviet custody. Adenauer agreed to exchange the political recognition the Soviet Union wanted for the return of the men. The prisoners arrived in West Germany in the autumn and winter of 1955. Their return was met with enormous public attention. For many families, it was the first definitive news they had received about a father, brother, or husband in more than a decade. For others, the returning men confirmed what had long been feared. Their relative was not among those coming back. One of the most publicly prominent of the returning prisoners was Friedrich Paulus, except that Paulus had not been held in a labor camp. After his surrender at Stalingrad, he had been treated with a degree of special attention by Soviet authorities, who recognized his propaganda value. He gave statements critical of Hitler. He eventually cooperated with Soviet-sponsored anti-Nazi German political organizations. Paulus lived in Dresden, in East Germany, after his release in 1953, and died there in 1957. His fate was exceptional and is not representative of the general prisoner experience. The men who returned through Adenauer's 1955 agreement were predominantly those who had been held under the war criminal designation. Some had been convicted in trials that used procedural standards far below what Western legal systems would recognize. Others had genuinely committed serious crimes during the war. The Soviet system did not distinguish carefully between these categories, and neither the German government nor the returning men themselves were in a position to demand a public accounting. What those returning men described when they arrived home, the conditions, the years of labor, the deaths they had witnessed, began, for the first time, to give the German public a detailed picture of what Soviet captivity had actually been, and some of what they described had never been publicly known before. The testimonies gathered from returning German prisoners in 1955 and afterward, through German government hearings, Red Cross work, and private accounts survivors shared with historians, built a picture of Soviet captivity that had not been available before. Several recurring elements appear across hundreds of separate accounts from men held in different camps across the Soviet Union. The first is the experience of initial capture and transit. Almost universally, survivors describe the journey from the front to the first permanent camp as among the most deadly phases of captivity. Men were marched for days in conditions unsuited for the season, with minimal food. Those who could not keep pace were left behind. Transit camps used as waypoints were overcrowded and without adequate shelter. A significant number of total prisoner deaths occurred during this transit phase, before men even reached facilities where they would be formally registered. The second recurring element is the role of prisoner functionaries, men given limited authority over fellow prisoners by Soviet camp administrators. This system, similar to arrangements in German concentration camps, put some prisoners in control of barracks order, work detail assignments, and food distribution. The power this gave them was frequently abused. Accounts describe functionaries taking larger shares of rations, assigning the most dangerous work to men they disliked, and using physical force. Camp administrators tolerated it as a means of maintaining control without direct involvement. The third element is the experience of Soviet political persuasion efforts. From the beginning, Soviet political officers worked within the camps to recruit prisoners to anti-Nazi positions. The National Committee for a Free Germany, founded in 1943 with Soviet support, conducted propaganda work inside the camps. Prisoners who showed receptiveness sometimes received marginally better treatment, Most cooperated for pragmatic reasons rather than genuine conversion. But the Soviet system kept detailed records of prisoner attitudes, and those records influenced repatriation decisions for years. The fourth element, described consistently in accounts from men held during the late 1940s and early 1950s, is the Soviet judicial process. Men selected for trial as war criminals were brought before military tribunals with minimal procedural protection. Accusations were often vague, based on a man's unit or rank rather than specific acts. Sentences of 25 years were common. Some men received death sentences, which were carried out. The number of German prisoners formally executed by Soviet authorities is difficult to determine precisely. Soviet documentation on this period is incomplete. German historians estimate executions and deaths attributed directly to Soviet judicial action number in the tens of thousands, though the precise figure remains a subject of ongoing research. But the question of individual executions, as significant as it is, does not fully account for the total death toll. The majority of German prisoners who died in Soviet custody died not from bullets but from the same combination of causes that killed Soviet prisoners in German hands. And understanding exactly how that happened requires looking at one specific place where the record is unusually complete. Among the many camps established by the NKVD for German prisoners, Camp 7110, located in the Tambov region of Russia, southeast of Moscow, produced an unusually complete documentary record. The combination of Soviet administrative files, German Red Cross documentation, and survivor testimony gathered after the war makes it one of the most thoroughly studied individual prisoner facilities of this period. Camp 7110 received large numbers of Stalingrad survivors in early 1943. The men who arrived there were already in serious physical condition. Months of encirclement, brutal combat, and inadequate supply had left them weakened before they ever entered Soviet custody. The march and transit journey had weakened them further. What the Soviet camp records from Tambov show, and what makes those records so historically significant, is the bureaucratic documentation of mass death in real time. Monthly reports filed by the camp administration, record food allocations, labor assignments, medical statistics, and mortality figures. The reports are written in the flat, administrative language of Soviet bureaucracy, but the numbers they contain are extraordinary. In February and March 1943, the monthly death rate at Camp 7110 reached levels that indicate the camp was losing a significant fraction of its population every month. The causes listed in the medical records, dystrophy, meaning starvation-related physical collapse, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, are the same causes that appear in German camp records for Soviet prisoners in 1941 and 1942. The parallel is precise and uncomfortable. The Tambov camp records also document the food ration structure in detail. Prisoners were allocated different ration categories based on their labor output, a system in which those who were too ill to work received less food than those who could. The practical effect of this system was to accelerate the death of the sick. Men who were already weakened received less nutrition, became weaker still, were unable to work, received still less food, and died. The ration system, rather than stabilizing the population, functioned as a mechanism that sorted men toward death once they had crossed the threshold of physical deterioration. Soviet camp administrators at Tambov filed reports noting the situation and requesting additional food supplies. Those requests moved through the NKVD bureaucracy. Some additional allocations were made. They were insufficient to reverse the trajectory. By the time the acute crisis of the winter of 1943 had passed, Camp 7110 had lost an enormous proportion of the men who had arrived from Stalingrad. The survivors, those who had possessed enough initial physical resilience, or who had received marginally better treatment, or who had simply had luck, entered the labor phase of their captivity. Some of them would remain in Tambov and at other facilities in the region for years. The Tambov camp documentation was made available to German researchers in the 1990s through the Joint German-Russian Historical Commission. The commission's work, carried out over more than a decade, produced a multi-volume scholarly study that remains the most comprehensive examination of the German prisoner question in Soviet custody. Its findings confirmed that the death toll, estimated at approximately 1.1 million, was not the result of deliberate extermination policy in the sense that the Holocaust was, but was rather the result of policy decisions and conditions that were predictable in their lethal outcomes, and that continued long after those outcomes were known to Soviet authorities. That distinction between deliberate extermination and lethal neglect has been at the center of the historical and legal debate surrounding German prisoners in Soviet hands ever since. And the way different countries have addressed that question tells its own story about memory, politics, and the long aftermath of the war. The history of German prisoners in Soviet captivity occupied an unusual position in the post-war decades. In West Germany, the subject was present. Families of missing men, veterans organizations, and politicians all engaged with it. But it was constrained. The Federal Republic was a new democracy trying to establish itself within the Western Alliance, and dwelling on German suffering carried political risks. Germany's moral debt from the war was vast, and centering German prisoner deaths in public discourse could too easily appear as an attempt to offset it. In East Germany, the subject was handled entirely differently. The East German state was a Soviet satellite, and the Soviet Union's treatment of German prisoners was not open to critical examination. Official history emphasized the crimes of fascism and the heroism of the Soviet Union. German soldiers who died in Soviet captivity were not commemorated, not studied, and not publicly discussed. In the Soviet Union itself, the prisoner population's existence was acknowledged, but the conditions and death toll were not subjects of open inquiry. The official position, that the Soviet Union had acted legally and appropriately, was maintained throughout the Cold War. For decades, families of men who had died in Soviet captivity had no official acknowledgement of what had happened. Death certificates, where they existed, were often vague. Men were listed as missing. The bureaucratic ambiguity around their fates was never resolved. The opening of Soviet archives after 1991 changed this substantially. Russian and German historians working together, with access to NKVD records never examined by outside researchers, constructed a far more detailed account of the prisoner system than had previously been possible. Individual camp records, mortality figures, ration allocations, labor assignments, transportation records, all of it became available and was systematically analyzed. The joint German-Russian Historical Commission that undertook this work operated for more than a decade. It represented a form of bilateral historical reconciliation unusual in its depth. Two former adversaries jointly examining a chapter in which both had inflicted and both had suffered. The Commission's published findings have become the foundation for all subsequent scholarship on the subject. Memorial work has also proceeded, though unevenly. In Russia, plaques and small monuments mark some locations where German prisoners died in large numbers, including at Tambov. These exist quietly, without the public prominence of other war memorials, but they exist. The question of legal accountability for German prisoner deaths was never formally adjudicated. The Nuremberg tribunals did not address Soviet conduct toward German prisoners. Cold War division made any such accounting impossible. With the Soviet state gone and the individuals most responsible long dead, the question has passed entirely into the historical domain. What that domain has established is that the approximately 1.1 million German soldiers who did not return from Soviet captivity died in conditions shaped by policy decisions made at the highest levels of the Soviet state. Stalin personally reviewed NKVD prisoner reports. The ration systems, the labor quotas, the judicial processes that produced mass convictions, all operated within a system for which he bore ultimate responsibility. The men who died in those camps and those who survived and came home changed beyond recognition were the last casualties of a war that had cost the Soviet Union more than any nation had ever paid in a modern conflict. That context does not erase what happened to them. It places it within the full weight of what that war was. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.